Hey there. My YouTube channel's been sitting pretty idle for a while now. I haven't really done much. If you are one of my very, very few subscribers, a year or so ago, I did a short batch of just short streaming consciousness videos. A lot of times they had to do with stuff I was dealing with in seminary. I'm thinking of trying something new, and this is going to be a new attempt of engaging with people in sermon prep. Since my last videos were posted, I'm now ordained in a parish, preaching every week, and one of the things that I work on is, of course, just engaging with the text, and a lot of thought goes into it each and every time. So I'm just going to try this, and if people like it, we'll continue, and if not, that's fine too. But what I'll do is just talk about the text of the week that I'm preaching on and some of the thoughts that have come through. So this won't be organized. It won't be uh, really anything too special. It'll just be my thoughts, if nothing else, to help me organize. So if you have comments based on what you see, wonderful. If not, that's fine too. If this is the first time you've ever viewed me, my name is Scott Dalen. I am a pastor in Southwest Iowa and in a small congregation here, which I really enjoy, but that's beside the point. So the gospel lesson for this week, which comes from the Revised Common Lectionary, a 3-year cycle that takes us through a lot of the Bible, is John 14 verses 1 through 14. Now this is a pretty commonly known passage. It's got probably what I would consider to be one of the better known passages. There are many passages, of course, that are well known from the Bible, regardless of your knowledge of it, but this is one of them. And it is verse 14:6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's something I'm probably going to focus on within the sermon this week, I think. I'm not really sure yet, but that's an interesting passage, but it's divisive as well. I have found there are many people, typically believers, who hear "I am the way, the truth, and the life," and they find a lot of hope in that. And as well as some of the rest of the passage where the disciples are asking, hey, Jesus, show us the Father, or where are you going? Because Jesus tells them early on, I'm about to depart. And this is also the text that says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. There's hope within that passage as well. And because of that, and the talk of departing this life, departing the world, is the reasoning that this text tends to fall in a funeral situation. That's pretty common. But the disciples get freaked out. This happens, it's part of the farewell discourse, right after, actually during the Last Supper in John's account. Jesus is talking to the disciples for a pretty extended amount of time and tells them, hey, I'm about to leave this world. I'm going somewhere. And one of the disciples, Thomas in this case, says, we don't know where you're going. Show us. And Jesus is talking about going to the Father. And so much of this, I am the way, the truth, and the life, is aimed at the relationship that Jesus enables with God. Now, Jesus is God, and yet is human at the same time, confusing as that may be. But he allows us to be in relationship with God the Father, with his Father. And that's really what his mission was in life, to enable that relationship to come into existence again. It had been tainted by sin, broken by sin, but he is God. And in John's gospel, that is really the key, to believe that he is God and to believe that he is there to reestablish that relationship. So when Jesus says, I am the way, I believe he's saying, I am the way to the Father. Last week in the lectionary, the text was the Good Shepherd, and I am the gate. People come in and go out through me. And that's, I believe, echoed here. Jesus says, I am the truth, and I believe he is the truth of the Father, because he comes from God. He is God. He knows the truth of God, which goes far beyond our understanding, but yet is there. And then I am the life. We believe that the wages of sin is death. Paul talks about that in the book of Romans. And to say that I am the life, Jesus saying that, of course, says that, in me is life, and in me is the life that comes outside of sin. And even with Christ as believers, yes, we still feel the effects of sin. We see the effects of sin in our own lives, in the lives of those around us, and in the world. The world is not perfect. We don't claim it to be. But yet, in Jesus is life, and it's life with the Father. He is the way to the Father. He is the way to God, and the life that he's talking about is with them. And he says that, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But the verse continues, and no one comes to the Father except through me. The interesting part about that, possibly the difficult part of that for non-believers, this statement is one that really aims at the exclusivity of Christianity. And while believers can find a lot of hope in this particular verse, I tend to believe that non-believers see this as just exclusive, and they see this as a very shameful, perhaps. Maybe that's not the best way to say it, but just a very difficult passage, because it's judgmental, saying that, well, if I do not believe in Christ, then am I excluded? Do you just not care about me? Where do I stand? And that can be difficult. And as I prepare to preach this week on this text, that's something that I want to keep in mind. We never know who's going to be sitting in the pews. Oftentimes they are believers, but believers come in all shapes and sizes. And Paul also talks about the measure of faith being different for everyone, and questions happen. That's something I preach about a lot, that questions happen, doubt happens, moments of weakness happen, even within our lives of faith as believers. And that's not a bad thing. I think that God expects that. God knows us much better than we know ourselves. And so when we wrestle with passages like this, what do they mean? What do they mean for me as a believer? What do they mean for someone who's not a believer? What do they sound like to someone who's just hearing the gospel for the first time? These are questions that I wrestle with as I prepare to preach. They're questions I wonder about as a pastor. They're questions I wonder about as a Christian. And yeah, so that's that. But it's also interesting the way this passage begins. 14:1, the first thing Jesus says to the disciples in this moment is, do not let your hearts be troubled. And maybe that's a tone for us when we have these questions. Don't let your hearts be troubled by the confusing nature of what Jesus says. And much of what Jesus says is confusing. We see that time and time again, particularly with the response of either the disciples, who you would think would get it. They lived with the guy for 3 years, but oftentimes we see they don't get it. Or just the audience that he's talking to, whether it's people just listening to him preach, or people in the synagogue, or whatever. We see, or we hear the questions, we hear the confusion, we hear the narration within the gospel text saying that the people don't understand, and we see it here. Jesus says, you know the way to the place where I'm going. I'm leaving. You know the way to go. And Thomas, doubting Thomas, as he's commonly known, Jesus, how can we know the way? We don't know where you're going. And Jesus, facepalm. But and then he goes on and he talks some more. And if you know me, you know my Father, and you do know me. But then Philip, one of the other disciples, pops up. Well, Jesus, show us the Father and we'll be satisfied. Well, and Jesus facepalms again. And You know me, and because you know me, you know the Father as well, because my Father and I are one. It's just interesting, and we see this throughout the entirety of this long discourse, which starts late in chapter 13 and goes on for several chapters of Jesus talks, and then he's interrupted by a question. And what does that mean? And so faith is not without questions. Even those closest to Jesus had them. And that's not bad. We can learn from the examples of the disciples that questioning Jesus, questioning God within prayer or within just our day-to-day thoughts is okay. The disciples did it. And yet Jesus also told them, where I am going, I am preparing a place for you. And I will come back and will bring you to myself so that where I am, you will be also. Relationship again, and I talked about that a moment ago, but that's really the key to John's Gospel, is being in relationship with God. And Christ came to earth. God entered our reality as human to make that possible, to overcome to overcome the power of sin and death so that we may have life eternal. Now, does this mean that we will not die physically? No, of course not. We will all die. That's the way of life. But the hope that we find in our faith is that there is more. That beyond death, which Jesus also experienced and would experience very shortly after this passage takes place, is not the end, and there is more. So those are some of the thoughts that I've had on this passage this week as I'm trying to organize it into a coherent sermon. If you have thoughts, by all means, leave them in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. It would be great, and we'll see how the sermon goes. Thanks.